The galaxy had known peace for 3,000 years. The Collective, as it called itself, was made up of 47 different species, spread across 900 star systems. They traded, they argued, they sometimes had small conflicts, but nothing serious, nothing that could shake the foundations of their civilization. The rules were simple, and everyone followed them. Ships were built for speed and beauty. Weapons were designed to disable, not destroy. War, real war, was something from ancient history books that young aliens read about with horror and disbelief. Then the humans arrived. The first contact happened in the Valar system, a quiet corner of space where the Kirath people had been mining asteroids for 600 years. The Kirath were peaceful. They had blue skin, 4 arms, and a deep love for music and mathematics. Their ships looked like floating crystals, beautiful and fragile. When the strange vessel appeared at the edge of their system, they sent a greeting in 17 different languages, as was the custom. The ship that answered was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was blocky, angular, covered in strange panels and tubes. It looked like someone had taken a building and thrown it into space. The Kirath found it ugly, but they were polite people. They invited the strangers to their station for talks. The humans came aboard wearing thick suits and carrying devices the Kirath didn't recognize. They were soft creatures with only 2 arms and strange flat faces. They smiled a lot, which the Kirath later learned was a sign of friendliness, not aggression. The meeting went well. The humans explained that they came from a planet called Earth, far outside collective space. They had been traveling for many years, looking for other intelligent life. They were excited to find they were not alone in the universe. The Kirath reported this to the Collective Council, and within a month, diplomats from 12 different species arrived to meet these newcomers. The humans were strange. Everyone agreed on that. They ate dead animals, which most collective species found disturbing. They slept for 8 hours every day, which seemed like a terrible waste of time. Their ships were ugly, and their technology was primitive in some ways, but surprisingly advanced in others. But they were friendly. They wanted to trade. They wanted to learn. The Collective decided to welcome them, though some species were cautious. The Vaughn, a race of tall insect-like beings who served as the Collective's military leaders, studied the human ships carefully. What they found confused them. Human ships were built with multiple backup systems. Every important component had 2 or 3 copies. The hulls were thick and layered, designed to take damage and keep functioning. Most strange of all, the humans had powerful weapons, real weapons, designed to kill and destroy. When the Vaughn asked about this, the human ambassador, a woman named Sarah Chen, looked uncomfortable. She explained that humanity had a difficult history. They had fought many wars among themselves. Their planet had been scarred by conflict. They had learned to build ships that could survive terrible punishment because they had needed to. The Vaughn filed this information away and didn't think much more about it. After all, the humans had only 12 ships and a few thousand people. They were newcomers to the galactic community. They would learn the ways of peace, just as every other species had. For 50 years, the humans lived among the Collective. They were good neighbors. They traded fairly, learned quickly, and made friends easily. Human music became popular among several species. Human food, strange as it was, developed a following. Human engineers were highly sought after because they could fix almost anything. They had a talent for making machines work even when they shouldn't. The humans built more ships and expanded to 3-star systems the Collective had never bothered to colonize. These were harsh worlds, difficult to live on. But the humans seemed to like challenges. Their population grew to several million. They were still a small species compared to the great powers of the Collective, but they were growing. Then the darkness came. It started at the edge of collective space, in the frontier systems where only mining colonies and research stations existed. Ships began disappearing. At first, everyone thought it was accidents or pirates, but then entire stations went silent. When rescue ships arrived, they found only debris and death. The first real battle happened at Corvin Station, a trading post with 50,000 inhabitants. A Vaughn patrol fleet was nearby when the attack came. 12 Vaughn warships, the pride of the collective military, faced the enemy for the first time. The battle lasted 4 minutes. The enemy ships were black, almost invisible against the void of space. They moved faster than anything the collective had ever seen. Their weapons were devastating. The Vaughn ships, designed for light combat and peacekeeping, were completely outmatched. Their shields failed instantly. Their hulls cracked like eggshells. 11 ships were destroyed in the first minute. The 12th managed to escape and send a warning before being hunted down and killed. Coven Station was destroyed completely. No survivors, no explanation, no mercy. The Collective Council met in emergency session. For the first time in 3,000 years, they faced a real threat. They called this enemy the Darkness, because no one knew what they really were. The black ships didn't communicate. They didn't negotiate. They simply appeared, destroyed everything, and moved on. The Vaughn began building warships as fast as they could. But they had a problem. Their entire military philosophy was based on preventing fights, not winning them. Their ships were designed to be fast and impressive, meant to scare away trouble rather than engage it. Against the darkness, they were useless. Over the next 2 years, the darkness pushed deeper into collective space. 20 systems fell, hundreds of millions died. The Vaughn threw fleet after fleet at the enemy, and fleet after fleet was destroyed. They tried different tactics, different weapons, different everything. Nothing worked. The darkness was simply too powerful. Some species began to abandon the collective, fleeing to the far corners of the galaxy. Others surrendered, hoping the darkness would spare them. It didn't. The black ships destroyed everything equally, without preference or prejudice. The human ambassador requested an audience with the Collective Council. Sarah Chen was old now, her hair white and her face lined, but her eyes were sharp. She stood before the representatives of 47 species and made a simple offer. Let us fight. The council was confused. The humans had only a few hundred ships. The Vaughn had lost thousands. What could the humans possibly do that the collective's own military could not? Chen explained patiently. Humans knew war, real war, not the polite conflicts the collective had engaged in for millennia. Human ships were built to take damage and keep fighting. Human weapons were designed to kill. Human soldiers were trained to survive impossible situations and keep going. The Vaughn Admiral, a towering insect named Crix, was insulted by this suggestion. He had lost many friends in the war against the darkness. He had watched his best ships be torn apart. Now this soft, small creature was suggesting that her primitive people could do better. Chen didn't argue. She simply asked for one chance, one battle. Let a human fleet face the darkness alongside a Vaughn fleet. If the humans failed, they would fall back and let the Vaughn continue as they had been. If they succeeded, maybe the collective would consider listening to them. The council debated for 3 days. Many were against the idea. The humans were too small, too primitive, too new to the galaxy, but the Vaughn had no better options. Every day, another system fell. Every day, more people died. What did they have to lose? They agreed. The battle was set for the Valar system, where humanity had first made contact with the collective. It was fitting, in a way. If the humans were going to prove themselves, they would do it where their journey had begun. The Vaughn sent 500 ships, their latest designs armed with their most powerful weapons. The humans sent 53 vessels. To the Vaughn, this seemed almost insulting. Did the humans not understand the seriousness of the situation? Admiral Crix met the human commander before the battle. His name was James Morrison, a stocky man with grey at his temples and scars on his hands. He had been a soldier on Earth before joining the space fleet. He spoke quietly, without boasting, but there was something in his eyes that made even Crix uncomfortable. This human had seen death before, many times. Crix asked Morrison what his strategy was. Morrison smiled and said something that confused the Admiral completely. We're going to let them hit us. The Vaughn didn't understand. The darkness ships were devastating. Their weapons tore through the strongest shields and thickest armor. To let them hit you was to die. But Morrison wouldn't explain further. He simply asked that the Vaughn ships stay behind the human line, until the first exchange of fire. After that, they could do whatever they wanted. The darkness arrived exactly when the collective's sensors predicted. 32 black ships, moving in perfect formation, heading straight for Valar. It was a small force by darkness standards. They probably expected an easy victory. The human fleet moved to intercept. Their ships looked even uglier up close, blocky and rough, covered in thick armor plates and studded with weapons. The Vaughn watched from behind, ready to move in and rescue the humans when their pathetic fleet was destroyed. The first shots were fired by the darkness. Their weapons were terrible to behold, beams of energy so dark they seemed to eat light itself. The beams struck the human ship's dead center, impacts that should have torn them apart instantly. The human ships rocked, armor plating cracked and fell away. Hull breaches appeared along their sides. But the ships didn't die. They kept moving. They kept flying. And then they started shooting back. Human weapons were crude by collective standards. Simple projectiles accelerated to incredible speeds, balls of metal moving so fast they glowed white-hot. Missiles that carried nuclear warheads, something the collective had banned centuries ago. Lasers so powerful they could cut through a small moon. The darkness ships were fast and deadly, but they had never fought an enemy that could survive their first strike. Their tactics were built around overwhelming force, destroying everything before it could respond. Against the humans, those tactics failed. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of brutal, grinding combat, the likes of which the galaxy had not seen in 3,000 years. Human ships took hit after hit, losing armor, losing weapons, losing crew, but they refused to die. They kept fighting even when they were crippled, even when they were burning, even when all logic said they should be dead. Morrison's flagship, the Endurance, took 17 direct hits during the battle. By the end, half the ship was open to space. 2/3 of the crew were dead or wounded. The engines were failing, the weapons were overheating, and the life support was running on backup power. But the Endurance kept fighting until the last darkness ship was destroyed. When the battle ended, 18 human ships were still functional. 35 had been damaged beyond repair but were still intact enough to recover their crews. Not a single human vessel had been completely destroyed. The darkness had lost all 32 ships. Admiral Crix's fleet had not fired a single shot. They had watched the entire battle in stunned silence. They had seen the impossible. They had seen ships survive what should have killed them a dozen times over. They had seen humans refuse to die. The news spread across the collective like wildfire. The darkness could be defeated. It could be killed. And the humans, the strange newcomers, with their ugly ships and violent history, had shown everyone how. The Collective Council met again, but this time the mood was different. There was hope now, something that had been missing for 2 years. Representatives who had been ready to flee now spoke of fighting back. Admiral Crix, who had been insulted by the humans before, now stood and spoke in their favor. "I have served the Collective for 200 years, he said. "I have seen many battles, many enemies, many tactics. I have never seen anything like what I witnessed at Valar. The humans don't fight like us. They don't think like us. They survive. And in this war, survival is everything." Sarah Chen spoke next. She was tired, having barely slept since the battle, but her voice was strong. "We didn't come to your galaxy to fight your wars. We came looking for friends. But we found something else here, something worth protecting. The Collective gave us a home when we had none. Now we'll help you keep that home safe." The Council voted unanimously to accept humanity's help. More than that, they voted to learn from them. Vaughn engineers would study human ship designs. Collective factories would begin producing human-style weapons. Human officers would train collective soldiers in their tactics. The war was far from over. The darkness was vast, with thousands of ships spread across hundreds of systems. But for the first time since the invasion began, the Collective believed they could win. They had seen the proof with their own eyes. Ships could survive. Ships could fight back. Ships could win, and humanity would show them how. In the weeks after the Battle of Valar, Commander James Morrison became the most famous human in the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of species wanted to meet him, to shake his hand, to ask him questions about how he had done the impossible. He answered their questions politely, but he seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He was a soldier, not a politician. He wanted to get back to fighting. The first priority was repairing the human fleet. Of the 53 ships that had fought at Velar, only 18 were still combat-ready. The rest needed weeks or months of work. The collective offered their best shipyards, their finest engineers, their most advanced materials. The humans accepted gratefully, but they also made some unusual requests. They wanted to keep their ships ugly. Not just ugly, but deliberately rough and industrial. When the Kirath engineers asked why, the human technicians explained. Beautiful ships made you think about preserving them. Ugly ships made you think about using them. A crew that loved their ship too much would hesitate to put it in danger. A crew that saw their ship as a tool would use it without mercy. This philosophy disturbed many in the collective, but they couldn't argue with the results. The human fleet had survived because the crews didn't care about keeping their ships pretty. They cared about winning. Morrison spent most of his time studying the darkness. The wrecked ships from Velar had been towed to a research station, where scientists from 50 species were examining every piece. What they found was disturbing. The darkness ships weren't built, they were grown. The black holes were some kind of organic material, harder than any metal but with the structure of living tissue. The weapons were organs, biological systems that generated energy through processes no one understood. The engines were muscles contracting and relaxing to push the ships through space, and at the center of each vessel was something that looked disturbingly like a brain. The darkness wasn't a civilization. It was a creature, or maybe a collection of creatures working together. The scientists couldn't tell if the ships were intelligent on their own or if they were controlled by something else. Either way, it explained why the darkness never negotiated, never communicated, never showed mercy. You couldn't negotiate with a disease. You couldn't reason with a predator. Morrison spent hours looking at the remains, thinking about what they meant. He had fought many enemies in his life, human and alien. He knew how to read an opponent, to find their weaknesses, to predict their moves. But this enemy was different. It didn't think like a soldier or a general. It thought like a hunter, and hunters went after the weakest prey first. He requested a meeting with Admiral Crix and the other collective military leaders. When they gathered, he laid out his concerns. The darkness had been attacking the edge of collective space, the poorly defended frontier systems, but they were getting closer to the core, to the heavily populated worlds where billions of people lived. If the darkness reached those systems, the killing would be catastrophic. The collective's current strategy was defensive. They stationed fleets at important systems and waited for the darkness to attack. Morrison said this was exactly wrong. The darkness was choosing when and where to fight. They were picking targets that were weak and avoiding places that were strong. The collective was letting them control the war. Morrison proposed something different. Attack. The collective officers were shocked. Attack the darkness? Their ships were terrifying enough when they came to you. To go looking for them seemed insane. But Morrison explained his thinking. The darkness moved in patterns. They came from somewhere, some base or homeworld or spawning ground. If the collective could find that place and destroy it, maybe they could end the war, or at least hurt the enemy badly enough to buy time. The problem was finding the source. The darkness ships appeared from deep space, from regions that had never been explored. The collective had sent scouts to those areas before, but none had returned. Whatever was out there, it killed anything that came close. Morrison smiled at this. He had an idea about that too. Humans were good at surviving, but they were also good at hiding. On Earth, they had developed something called stealth technology, ways of making ships invisible to sensors. The collective had similar technology, but they had never taken it as far as humans had. Humans had spent centuries trying to hide from each other, developing better and better ways of becoming invisible. Morrison proposed building a new kind of ship, something small and fast, covered in stealth systems so advanced that even the darkness couldn't see it. They would send these ships into the unknown regions, mapping the darkness territory, looking for the source. When they found it, they would come back and report. The Collective Council debated this for 2 weeks. Many were against it. Sending ships into the void was too dangerous. The darkness would find them and destroy them. But the alternative was waiting for the enemy to come to them. Fighting a defensive war they were slowly losing. In the end, they approved the mission. Human engineers began designing the stealth ships, working with the best minds from a dozen species. The vessels they created were unlike anything seen before, small, barely larger than a shuttle, but packed with the most advanced sensors and stealth systems in the galaxy. They called them Shadows. 12 Shadows were built, and 12 human pilots volunteered to fly them. They knew the mission was dangerous. Some of them might not come back, but they also knew that the entire collective was depending on them. Millions of lives hung in the balance. Morrison wanted to lead the mission himself, but the Council refused. He was too important, they said, too valuable. His experience was needed to train the new collective fleets, to teach them how to fight like humans. He argued, but in the end, he accepted their decision. The Shadows would fly without him. The mission launched 3 months after the Battle of Valar. The 12 small ships slipped away from collective space and headed into the darkness between stars. They would be gone for at least 6 months, maybe longer. All anyone could do was wait. While they waited, Morrison kept busy. He travelled from system to system, visiting collective military bases and teaching their officers what he knew. The lessons were hard for many of them to accept. Human military doctrine was built around one simple idea: endure. You couldn't always win a fight. Sometimes the enemy was too strong, too fast, too numerous. When that happened, you had one job: survive. Stay alive long enough for the situation to change. Take hits, lose ground, suffer casualties, but never give up. Never surrender. Never stop fighting. This was the opposite of what the collective had been taught. Their doctrine emphasized avoiding losses at all costs. Retreat was always preferable to taking damage. Ships were expensive and crews were precious. Any commander who lost too many vessels would be removed from duty. Morrison told them this thinking was wrong. In war, you had to accept losses. You had to be willing to sacrifice ships, equipment, even lives to achieve your goals. The collective had been losing because they refused to pay the price of victory. Some officers were offended by this. They accused Morrison of being callous, of not caring about the lives of his crew. He didn't argue with them. He simply showed them the records from Valar. He showed them how his crews had kept fighting when their ships were crippled, when their friends were dying around them, when all hope seemed lost. He showed them how survival worked. Slowly, the attitude began to change. The Vaughn were the first to embrace the new thinking. They were warriors by nature, even if centuries of peace had softened them. They understood what Morrison was saying, even if it made them uncomfortable. The other species followed, some eagerly, some reluctantly. New ships began rolling off the assembly lines. They were still collective designs, still elegant and fast, but now they had thicker armor, more backup systems, more weapons. They weren't as beautiful as the old ships, but they were tougher. They could take a hit and keep fighting. 6 months passed. Then 7. Then 8. The Shadows had not returned. Morrison didn't give up hope. Space was vast, and the unknown regions were far away. The pilots had been told to take their time, to be careful, to prioritize survival over speed. If they hadn't come back yet, it might simply mean they were being cautious. But as the months stretched on, even he began to worry. Had the darkness found them? Were the stealth systems not good enough? Had he sent 12 brave pilots to their deaths for nothing? Then, in the 9th month, a shadow returned. It appeared at the edge of the Valar system, barely functional, its pilot half dead from exhaustion and injury. The little ship limped into port, and the pilot was rushed to medical care. When she was strong enough to talk, she told them what she had found. The other 11 shadows were gone. Some had been destroyed by the darkness. Others had simply disappeared, lost in the vast emptiness. She had almost died herself, more than once, but she had completed the mission. She had found the source. Deep in the void, far beyond any star the collective had ever seen, there was a place where the darkness was born, a structure so large it dwarfed planets, a living machine that stretched across light years of space, pulsing with dark energy, spawning ships by the thousand. The pilot called it the Hive. Morrison listened to her report with growing dread. The Hive was bigger than anything he had imagined. Attacking it would require more ships than the collective had ever assembled. It would be the largest military operation in galactic history. But it could be done. The Hive was powerful, but it wasn't infinite. It had limits, vulnerabilities, weaknesses. If they could gather enough force, if they could strike hard enough, they might be able to destroy it. He called another meeting of the Collective Council. This time, he didn't ask for permission. He told them what they had to do. They had to build the biggest fleet in history. They had to train every crew to fight like humans, and then they had to attack the Hive and burn it out of existence. The council listened. They were afraid. He could see it in their eyes. But they were also angry. They had lost too many worlds, too many people, too many friends. They wanted revenge. They wanted to fight back. They voted yes. The preparations would take time. Years, probably. They needed to build ships, train crews, plan the attack. And while they did all that, the darkness would keep coming, keep killing, keep destroying. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time, the collective had a goal. Not just survival, but victory. Not just defending what they had, but destroying the threat forever. It was a long road ahead, a hard road, full of sacrifice and pain. Humanity would lead the way, and the galaxy would follow. The years that followed were the hardest the collective had ever known. While the great fleet was being built, while crews were being trained, and weapons were being forged, the darkness continued its relentless advance. Every month brought news of another system lost, another world burned, another million lives snuffed out. Commander Morrison worked himself nearly to death. He was everywhere at once, or so it seemed. One week he would be on Vaughn Prime, training their elite officers in human combat tactics. The next he would be inspecting a shipyard in the Kirath systems, making sure the new vessels met his standards. Then he would rush to some besieged frontier world, taking personal command of the defense. He aged 10 years in too. His hair went completely white. His face became a map of lines and wrinkles. He developed a persistent cough that the doctors couldn't explain, but he never stopped. He couldn't stop. Too many people were depending on him. The new ships were magnificent, not beautiful in the collective sense, but impressive in their brutal functionality. Each one was a fortress, layered with armor and shields, bristling with weapons, packed with redundant systems that would keep it fighting even after catastrophic damage. The engineers had learned the human lesson well. Ugly ships survive. The Vaughn called their new flagship class the Endurance, after Morrison's ship at the Battle of Vela. There were 12 of them, each one the size of a small moon, carrying enough firepower to level a planet. The humans built their own capital ships, even larger and more powerful, with names that reflected their philosophy: persistence, defiance, unbreaking, spite. The fleet grew. 1,000 ships, then 2,000, then 5,000. Species that had never had military vessels began building them. Peaceful races that had forgotten what war meant learned to fight again. The darkness had awakened something ancient and terrible in the hearts of every species in the collective, a survival instinct that had been dormant for millennia. But ships alone wouldn't win the war. They needed crews, brave souls willing to fly into the worst danger the galaxy had ever seen. The humans had no shortage of volunteers. Fighting and dying for a cause was something they understood deeply. But the collective species were different. Many were pacifists by nature, unable to take lives even to save their own. Morrison found a solution. He didn't ask the peaceful species to kill. He asked them to survive. Every ship needed more than warriors. They needed engineers to repair damage, medics to save wounded crew, pilots to fly shuttles and support craft. They needed people to run the sensors, manage the communications, keep the life support functioning. All of these jobs were essential, and none of them required killing. The peaceful species embraced this idea. The Kirath became the fleet's primary repair crews, their forearms perfectly suited for complex mechanical work. The Selen, a species of small telepaths, served as communications officers, linking ships together with their minds. The Brood, a hive species that thought in networks, managed the fleet's logistics with perfect efficiency. Every species found its place. Every species contributed. The collective had never been more united. 2 years after the Shadow's return, the fleet was ready. 10,000 ships, crewed by representatives of all 47 species, armed with the deadliest weapons ever created. They gathered at the edge of known space, the largest military force in galactic history, ready to venture into the unknown. Morrison stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the Indomitable. It was a human design, but crewed by mixed species. His first officer was a Vaughn named Kral, the daughter of Admiral Crix. His chief engineer was a Kirath named Melody, who had personally rebuilt the engines 3 times during construction. His communications officer was a Selen named Voice, who spoke in whispers and saw with blind eyes. They were his family now, this strange mix of aliens and humans. They had trained together, fought together, nearly died together a dozen times. He trusted them with his life, and they trusted him with theirs. Sarah Chen came to see him before the fleet departed. She was over 100 years old now, kept alive by collective medical technology, but her mind was still sharp. She had retired from diplomacy years ago, but she still watched over humanity's place in the galaxy. She told Morrison that she was proud of him, proud of what he had accomplished, proud of what humanity had become. They had come to this galaxy as refugees, strangers in a strange land. Now they were leaders, guides, teachers. They had found a new home and made it better. Morrison thanked her, but he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The fleet was huge, but the hive was bigger. The crews were brave, but the darkness was merciless. So many things could go wrong. So many people could die. He had sent men to their deaths before, many times. It never got easier. Chen told him something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. She said that courage wasn't about not being afraid, it was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. The fleet was afraid, Morrison was afraid, but they were going to fight because some things were worth being afraid for. She kissed his cheek and left. He never saw her again. The fleet departed the next morning. 10,000 ships moving in formation, a river of metal and light flowing through the darkness between stars. The journey would take 3 weeks using the fastest routes through the void. 3 weeks of tension and waiting, of final preparations and last prayers. Morrison spent the time going over the battle plan. The Shadow pilot had given them detailed information about the hive, its structure, its defenses, its weaknesses. The plan was complex, involving multiple phases and thousands of coordinated movements. But at its heart, it was simple. Hit hard. Keep hitting. Don't stop until it's dead. The hive defended itself with the same ships that had been terrorizing collective space. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, swarming around the massive structure like insects protecting their nest. The fleet would have to fight through them to reach the hive itself. Then they would have to destroy the hive while fighting off constant attacks. Morrison estimated they would lose half the fleet, maybe more. It was a terrible price, but the alternative was worse. If the hive survived, it would keep producing ships forever. The war would never end. The collective would be slowly devoured, system by system, until nothing remained. Better to pay the price now and be done with it. The fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the hive system. The sight that greeted them was beyond anything the scouts had described. The hive was not just huge, it was alive. It pulsed with dark energy, tendrils of black matter stretching across space, feeding on stars and planets and anything else that came too close. The darkness ships rose to meet them. Not thousands, millions. The entire void filled with black shapes, an army of nightmares coming to defend their home. Morrison felt fear, real fear, for the first time in years. This was bigger than anything he had prepared for. The fleet was outnumbered 100 to 1. The battle plan was worthless. They were all going to die. Then he heard something that changed everything. A human pilot, somewhere in the fleet, began to sing. It was an old song from Earth, a war song from a time when humans had fought each other with swords and spears. The words were simple, about courage and defiance and refusing to surrender. Other voices joined in. Human voices at first, then Vaughn voices, then Kirath and Selen and Brood and all the rest. The song spread through the fleet, carried by radio and telepathy and simple shouting. 10,000 ships, crewed by 50 species, singing the same song in a dozen different languages. Morrison listened, and he felt the fear fade. These were his people, all of them. They had come here to fight, to survive, to win. Numbers didn't matter. Odds didn't matter. What mattered was that they refused to give up. He opened a channel to the entire fleet. His voice was calm and steady, the voice of a commander who had seen this all before. "All ships, this is Commander Morrison. The enemy is bigger than we expected. That doesn't change anything. Our mission is the same. Destroy the hive. Save the collective. We knew this would be hard. We knew we might not all come back. But we came anyway, because that's what warriors do. Hold your positions. Follow the plan. And remember what we're fighting for." He paused, looking out at the approaching swarm of darkness ships. "Now let's show these bastards what it means to fight humans." The battle began. The first wave of darkness ships hit the fleet like a hammer. Their dark beams sliced through shields and armor, killing ships by the dozen. The outer ring of the collective formation crumbled in minutes, hundreds of vessels destroyed or crippled. But the fleet didn't run. The surviving ships closed ranks and kept fighting. Human tactics proved their worth once again. Damaged ships didn't retreat prepare. They kept firing until they couldn't fire anymore. Crippled vessels rammed into enemy formations, taking dozens of darkness ships with them. Every death was expensive. Every loss hurt the enemy. The Vaughn fought with a fury that surprised even Morrison. Their giant endurance-class ships ploughed through the enemy swarm, ignoring the damage they took, focusing only on killing as many darkness ships as possible. Admiral Crix's daughter, Kral, commanded one of these behemoths. She lost an arm in the first hour of battle, but refused to leave the bridge. The Vaughn didn't retreat, she told her crew. Not anymore. The Kirath repair crews performed miracles. They patched holes in hulls while battles raged around them. They restored weapon systems that should have been beyond saving. They kept ships fighting long after they should have been dead. One Kirath engineer, a young female named Crystal, single-handedly saved 3 different vessels, working for 18 hours without rest until she collapsed from exhaustion. The Selen telepaths coordinated the fleet's movements, linking minds across thousands of kilometers. They felt every death as if it were their own, sharing the pain of the dying across their network. Many went mad from the horror of it, but they kept working, kept communicating, because the fleet needed them. The battle lasted 12 hours. 12 hours of continuous fighting, continuous dying, continuous struggle. The collective fleet was pushed back again and again, losing ships by the hundreds. But they kept coming, kept fighting, kept advancing toward the hive. Morrison led from the front, his flagship at the tip of the spear. The Indomitable took hit after hit, losing armor, losing weapons, losing crew. His first officer, Kral, was killed when a dark beam sliced through the bridge. His chief engineer, Melody, was buried under debris when a section of the ship collapsed. His communications officer, Voice, went silent, either dead or overwhelmed by the psychic noise of the battle. Morrison kept fighting. He took the controls himself when the helmsman died. He fired the weapons himself when the gunnery crews were gone. He gave orders through a broken radio, not knowing if anyone could hear him. The fleet broke through. The outer defences of the hive crumbled under the relentless assault. The darkness ships fell back, regrouping around the central structure. The collective fleet had paid a terrible price. More than half the ships were gone, destroyed, or too damaged to fight. But the survivors pressed on, driven by rage and desperation, and the simple refusal to quit. The hive was even more terrifying up close. It pulsed with malevolent energy, tentacles of dark matter reaching out to grab at the approaching ships. Its surface crawled with smaller darkness creatures, defenders that swarmed over the collective vessels like parasites. Morrison gave the order for the final assault. The plan called for concentrated fire on the hive's core, the brain-like structure at its center. If they could destroy that, the whole thing might die. But the core was deep inside, protected by layers of organic armor and thousands of defenders. The remaining ships charged. There was no more formation, no more tactics, just a desperate rush toward the enemy's heart. The darkness fought back with everything it had. Dark beams swept through the fleet, destroying ships by the dozens. Tentacles grabbed vessels and crushed them. Swarms of defenders attacked from every direction. The advance slowed, then stopped, blocked by an impenetrable wall of darkness. Morrison looked at his screens and saw the end coming. The fleet had given everything, and it wasn't enough. They were going to fail. The hive was going to survive. The war was going to continue. Then he saw something that made his heart stop. The Indomitable's sensors detected a ship emerging from faster-than-light travel. Then another, then 10 more, then 100. A new fleet appeared at the edge of the battle. Ships of every design, from every species in the collective. The reinforcements had arrived. Morrison hadn't known they were coming. He later learned that the Collective Council had sent every remaining ship they had, stripping the defenses of 100 systems to give the attack one last chance. 10,000 more vessels, crewed by volunteers who knew they might be flying to their deaths. They hit the darkness from behind, catching the defenders between two fleets. The enemy formations shattered under the combined assault. For the first time in the battle, the darkness fell back in disorder. Morrison saw his chance. He pushed the Indomitable forward, ignoring the damage warnings, ignoring the fires burning in half the ship, ignoring everything but the target ahead. Other ships followed him, a ragged line of survivors driving toward the hive's core. They broke through. The core was vast, a pulsing mass of organic tissue that seemed to scream in Morrison's mind. He could feel its hatred, its hunger, its desperate will to survive. The darkness wasn't just an enemy. It was alive, truly alive, and it did not want to die. Morrison didn't care. He gave the order to fire, every weapon the Indomitable had left unleashed at once, pouring destruction into the core. Other ships joined in, their combined firepower overwhelming the organic defenses. The core burned. The core screamed. The core died. The effect was immediate. Throughout the hive, systems began failing. The dark tentacles went limp, the defender swarms fell apart, their coordination gone. The entire structure shuddered, cracks spreading across its surface. The hive was dying. Morrison ordered the fleet to retreat. They had done their job. Now they had to survive long enough to enjoy their victory. The battered survivors turned and ran, escaping the collapsing hive as fast as their damaged engines could carry them. The explosion was visible from light years away. The hive detonated with the force of a dying star, releasing all the dark energy it had accumulated over millennia. For a moment, that corner of space burned brighter than anything in the galaxy. Then it was over. The fleet gathered at the edge of the debris field, counting their losses. Of the 20,000 ships that had fought in the battle, barely 5,000 remained. Millions of crew members were dead or wounded. The victory had come at a terrible price, but they had won. Morrison stood on the bridge of his crippled flagship, looking out at the wreckage of the enemy that had terrorized the galaxy. He was wounded, exhausted, barely able to stand, but he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The war wasn't completely over. There would still be darkness ships scattered across collective space, cut off from the hive, running wild. It would take years to hunt them all down. But the source was destroyed. No more would be created. The nightmare was ending. He opened a channel to the surviving ships. "This is Commander Morrison. The hive is destroyed. The darkness is defeated. I know we lost many friends today. I know the price was high. But we did what we came here to do. We survived. We fought back. And we won." He paused, feeling the weight of the moment. Take a moment to remember those who fell. Then set course for home. We have a galaxy to rebuild. The fleet turned and began the long journey back to collective space. Behind them, the remains of the hive continued to burn, a funeral pyre for the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. Morrison sat down in his captain's chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he slept peacefully. The return journey took longer than expected. Many ships were too damaged to travel at full speed. Some had to be towed by others. A few broke down completely and had to be evacuated. But slowly, steadily, the fleet made its way home. News of the victory had travelled faster than they did. When they reached the first collective system, they found a celebration waiting for them. Ships from every species had gathered to welcome the returning heroes. Fireworks lit up the void. Music played on every frequency. Morrison was uncomfortable with the attention, but he understood why people needed to celebrate. They had lived in fear for so long. They had lost so much. Now, for the first time in years, they could hope for a better future. The fleet was dispersed to shipyards across the collective for repairs. Some ships were so damaged they would never fly again. They were converted into memorials, parked in orbit around important worlds, reminders of what had been sacrificed. Morrison was summoned to the collective council. He expected to give a report, to answer questions about the battle, to explain the decisions he had made. Instead, he found himself facing something very different. The council wanted to honour him. They wanted to make him an admiral, to give him command of all collective military forces. They wanted to build statues of him, name planets after him, write songs about his deeds. Morrison refused. He told them he was just a soldier who had done his job. There were thousands of others who had fought just as bravely, died just as nobly. They deserved the honours, not him. The council was confused. In their culture, heroes were celebrated. Those who achieved great things were rewarded with great recognition. Why would anyone refuse? Morrison tried to explain. In human culture, or at least in his understanding of it, the best leaders didn't seek glory for themselves. They gave credit to their people, shared the honours with those who had helped them succeed. He had commanded the fleet, but the victory belonged to everyone. The council accepted his refusal, though they didn't entirely understand it. They honoured him in smaller ways instead, ones he couldn't refuse. They named a new class of warship after him, the Morrison class heavy cruiser. They established a training academy in his name, where future commanders would learn the tactics he had developed. They made him a citizen of every collective species, a symbolic gesture that no one had ever received before. Morrison accepted these honours graciously, then asked to be assigned to the clean-up operations. There were still darkness ships to hunt, still battles to fight, still work to do. He wasn't ready to retire. Not yet. The council granted his request. For the next 5 years, Morrison led the campaign to eliminate the remaining darkness forces. It was dangerous work, chasing scattered enemies through the far corners of the galaxy, never knowing when or where they might appear, but it was necessary. The darkness couldn't be allowed to regroup. The human fleet grew during this period. More ships arrived from Earth, carrying colonists and soldiers and supplies. Humanity spread to new systems, building homes on worlds the collective had never bothered to settle. They were still a small species by galactic standards, but they were growing. Relations between humans and the collective species deepened. Marriages between species became common. Children were born who were neither fully human nor fully alien, but something new. The boundaries between peoples blurred. Morrison watched this with quiet satisfaction. This was what they had fought for. Not just survival, but a future. A future where different species could live together, learn from each other, build something greater than any of them could have made alone. He retired when he turned 70, his body finally giving out from decades of abuse. The collective gave him a small planet to live on, a peaceful world with blue skies and gentle oceans. He spent his remaining years there, writing his memoirs, teaching the occasional class, watching the galaxy grow and change. Sometimes he received visitors, old comrades from the war, young officers who wanted to meet the legendary commander, historians researching the Battle of the Hive. He welcomed them all, sharing stories and wisdom and the occasional glass of something strong. One visitor stood out from the rest, a young human woman named Hope, the granddaughter of one of his former crew members. She wanted to join the fleet, to serve as her grandmother had served. But she was nervous, uncertain, afraid she wouldn't measure up. Morrison told her the same thing Sarah Chen had told him years ago. Courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. The fleet needed brave souls, but it didn't need fearless ones. Fear kept you sharp. Fear kept you alive. Hope joined the fleet and eventually became a commander herself. She named her first ship the Chen, after the diplomat who had helped humanity find its place among the stars. Morrison died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83. The collective declared a day of mourning throughout the galaxy. Ships from every species gathered to honor him, filling the skies of his adopted world with light and sound. But the greatest honor came from the humans themselves. They didn't build a statue or name a planet after him. Instead, they wrote a song. It told the story of a soldier who had led them through the darkest times, who had taught them to survive when survival seemed impossible. The song became famous. It was sung at military academies and around campfires, at funerals and at weddings. It passed from generation to generation, changing slightly with each telling, but keeping its essential truth. The song ended with a simple message, one that Morrison himself had said many times over the years. Ships can survive. Ships can fight back. Ships can win. And so can we. The legacy of James Morrison lived on, not in monuments or medals, but in the hearts of those he had inspired. The collective prospered, the darkness faded into memory, and humanity took its place among the stars, no longer strangers, but family. The galaxy had faced its greatest challenge and emerged stronger. Different species had learned to work together, to trust each other, to fight side by side. The bonds forged in war proved stronger than any weapon. Peace returned, but it was a different kind of peace than before. The collective had learned that peace required strength. They maintained their fleets, trained their soldiers, watched the darkness between stars with wary eyes. They would never be caught unprepared again. But they also learned something else, something more important. They learned that strength came in many forms. The strength to fight, yes, but also the strength to forgive, the strength to rebuild, the strength to hope. Humanity had taught them all of these things, not through words, but through actions. The humans had faced the worst the universe could throw at them and refused to break. They had shown the galaxy what it meant to be truly alive, and the galaxy would never forget. 300 years passed since the destruction of the hive. 3 centuries of peace, prosperity, and growth. The collective had expanded to over 2,000 star systems, its population numbering in the trillions. The old fears faded. The old wars became stories told to children, lessons from a distant past that seemed almost impossible to believe. Humanity had changed the most. Once refugees with a handful of ships, they now controlled over 200 systems and billions of people. Human engineering, human tactics, human philosophy had spread throughout the galaxy. Every military academy taught human combat doctrine. Every shipyard used human design principles. Every species knew the human saying that had become the collective's unofficial motto: "We survive." The descendants of James Morrison and his crew were scattered across the stars. Some were soldiers, some were scientists, some were artists and teachers. The Morrison bloodline had merged with a dozen alien species, creating families that spanned the galaxy. Pope Morrison's great-great-granddaughter commanded the largest fleet in collective history. Her first officer was a Vaughn, her chief engineer was half Kirath, her communications officer was a full-blooded Cellon. This was the new normal. This was the future that had been purchased with blood and sacrifice. It was a good future, a peaceful future, a future worth all the pain it had taken to achieve. Then the signal came. It started as a whisper at the edge of sensor range, a pattern of energy that the automated systems flagged as unusual. At first, the analysts thought it was a natural phenomenon, some kind of stellar event that hadn't been documented before. But the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. It was artificial. Someone was transmitting from the void between galaxies. Admiral Sarah Morrison, commander of the Outer Rim Fleet, was the first senior officer to be informed. She was a tall woman with her ancestors' sharp eyes and steady hands. She had spent her entire career preparing for threats that never came, defending against enemies that didn't exist. Now, for the first time, something was actually happening. She ordered a closer look. The signal was coming from a region of space that no collective ship had ever visited, a gap between the galaxies where nothing should exist. The collective's most powerful sensors strained to see what was there, and what they found made Sarah's blood run cold. Ships. Thousands of them. Millions of them. A fleet so vast it defied comprehension, gathering in the darkness, preparing to move. Sarah immediately contacted the Collective Council. Emergency session. Top priority. The representatives gathered within hours, their faces flickering on screens across the galaxy. They saw what Sarah's sensors had found, and they understood what it meant. The darkness was back, or something like it. The sensors couldn't tell for certain if these ships were the same as the ones that had terrorized the Collective 300 years ago, but they were similar. The same dark hulls, the same organic structures, the same sense of cold malevolence radiating from every vessel. The hive's destruction had not ended the threat. It had only wounded it. The council erupted in argument. Some said they should attack immediately, before the enemy finished gathering. Others said they should strengthen their defenses and wait. A few suggested sending diplomats, trying to communicate, hoping that these creatures might be different from the ones they had fought before. Sarah listened to all of them, but she already knew what had to be done. She called for silence and spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 300 years of Morrison leadership. My ancestor faced the darkness when we had nothing. 12 ships, a few thousand people. He didn't know if he could win. He didn't know if anyone would survive. But he fought anyway, because that's what humans do. That's what the collective does. Now, we don't wait for the enemy to come to us. We don't hope they'll leave us alone. We take the fight to them. She paused, looking at each representative in turn. We have 300 years of preparation. We have fleets beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. We have technology that would seem like magic to the people who fought the First War. If we can't beat this enemy, no one can. So let's stop arguing and start fighting. The council voted to prepare for war. Sarah was given command of the combined fleet, the largest military force ever assembled, ships from every species, crewed by every race, armed with the deadliest weapons ever created. Over 100,000 vessels, each one built to survive. The preparations took 6 months. 6 months of frantic activity, of ships being recalled from distant stations, of factories working around the clock to produce weapons and supplies. 6 months of fear and hope and determination. Sarah used the time wisely. She studied her ancestors' tactics, looking for lessons that still applied. She consulted with the oldest members of every species, those who remembered the stories their grandparents had told about the First War. She trained her crews relentlessly, pushing them to their limits and beyond. The enemy didn't wait for them to be ready. 3 months into the preparations, the darkness began to move. They came from the void like a tide of shadow, sweeping into the outer systems with terrifying speed. The first worlds to fall were mining colonies, barely defended outposts that never had a chance. Then, larger worlds began to burn. Then, entire systems went dark. The Collective's defensive fleets fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. The Darkness ships were more powerful than anyone remembered, their weapons stronger, their tactics sharper. They had learned from their defeat 300 years ago. They had evolved. Sarah had to launch her counterattack before she was ready. She gathered what forces she could, 60,000 ships instead of the 100,000 she had planned for, and set course to intercept the enemy advance. The two fleets met in the Corvan system, the same place where the first major battle of the First War had been fought. Sarah had chosen it deliberately. If she was going to fight for the survival of the collective, she would do it where her ancestors had first proven that survival was possible. The darkness outnumbered her 3-1. Their ships were larger, their weapons were stronger, their tactics were unpredictable. Every analysis suggested that she would lose. Sarah had one advantage. She had something the darkness didn't have. She had 300 years of human ingenuity. The new weapons were unveiled in the first moments of battle. They were called sunbreakers, missiles carrying payloads of artificial stellar matter. When they detonated, they created miniature stars that burned with the fury of the universe itself. The darkness ships melted like ice before a flame. But the enemy adapted quickly. They spread out, making themselves harder targets. They developed shields that could block the sunbreakers, at least partially. They threw endless waves of smaller ships at the collective fleet, overwhelming the defenses through sheer numbers. The battle became a grinding nightmare. Ships died by the hundreds on both sides, the void filled with debris and bodies, the wreckage of two civilizations tearing each other apart. Sarah commanded from her flagship, the Indomitable III, named after her ancestor's vessel. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the expectations of everyone who had come before. 3 days into the battle, the collective fleet was on the verge of collapse. They had destroyed millions of darkness ships, but millions more kept coming. The sunbreakers were running low. The crews were exhausted. Many ships were so damaged they could barely fire their weapons. Sarah faced a choice. She could retreat, save what remained of her fleet, fall back to defend the core worlds. Or she could push forward, sacrifice everything for one final assault on the enemy's center. She thought about her ancestor, standing on the bridge of the original Indomitable, facing the same choice 300 years ago. He had pushed forward. He had won, but times were different now. The enemy was stronger. The odds were worse. Then she received a message from across the fleet. It was the same song her ancestors had sung at the Battle of the Hive, the old war song from Earth. It spread from ship to ship, species to species, a wave of defiance rolling through the broken fleet. Sarah smiled. The choice had already been made. It had been made 300 years ago, when a handful of humans had shown the galaxy what it meant to fight. She gave the order to advance. The collective fleet pushed forward with everything they had left. Ships that should have been evacuated stayed in formation. Weapons that should have been too damaged to fire were forced to work one more time. Every crew member, from the highest admiral to the lowest technician, did their part. The darkness fought back with terrible fury. Their weapons tore through the advancing fleet, killing ships by the dozens. Their defenders swarmed over the collective vessels, trying to stop the advance. For a moment it seemed like the charge would fail. Then something unexpected happened. The darkness stopped. Not retreated, not regrouped. Stopped. Every ship, every weapon, every defender went still. The entire enemy fleet hung motionless in space, as if frozen by some invisible force. Sarah stared at her screens, trying to understand what had happened. Then she received a communication from her science officers. They had detected an energy signature at the heart of the enemy formation, something massive, something that was generating a control signal for the entire darkness fleet. A new hive, a mobile hive hidden among the ships, directing their actions. The hive was dying. Sarah didn't know why. Maybe the sunbreakers had damaged something critical. Maybe the hive had pushed itself too hard, trying to control millions of ships at once. Maybe it was simply old, worn out, reaching the end of its lifespan. Whatever the reason, the control signal was failing. She saw her chance. She ordered every surviving ship to concentrate fire on the hive's location. Everything they had left, every missile, every beam, every last weapon. The combined firepower of 30,000 ships focused on a single point. The hive died. The effect was even more dramatic than the first time. Without the hive's control, the darkness ships had no coordination, no strategy, no purpose. They drifted aimlessly, crashing into each other, firing their weapons at random. Many simply shut down, their organic systems failing without the hive's guiding intelligence. The collective fleet didn't waste the opportunity. They hunted down every darkness ship they could find, destroying them before they could recover. The battle became a massacre. Months of fear and suffering finally released in a fury of vengeance. When it was over, Sarah's fleet had lost half its number. 30,000 ships destroyed, millions of crew members dead, but the darkness was gone. Truly gone this time, she hoped. The void between galaxies was empty once more. Sarah broadcast a message to the survivors. It's over. We won. Again. The celebration was muted by grief. Every family in the collective had lost someone. Every species mourned their dead, but beneath the sorrow, there was pride. They had faced the greatest threat imaginable, and they had survived. They had proven once again that the collective could not be broken. Sarah returned home to the hero's welcome she had expected and dreaded. Parades, speeches, medals, all the things her ancestor had refused but she couldn't avoid. She accepted them gracefully, always giving credit to her crews, always honouring those who had fallen. But her mind was already on the future. The darkness had returned once. It might return again. The galaxy couldn't afford to be complacent, to let 300 years of peace lull them into weakness. They needed to be ready, always ready for whatever came next. Sarah proposed a new initiative to the Collective Council. Permanent defense fleets stationed at the edge of known space. Deep space monitoring systems that could detect threats years before they arrived. A standing military tradition that would never again be allowed to fade. The Council agreed. They had learned their lesson. Peace was precious, but it had to be protected. Strength was the price of survival. Sarah spent the rest of her life building this new system. She established training academies on 100 worlds, all teaching human combat doctrine. She oversaw the construction of defensive stations along the galactic rim. She wrote manuals and gave lectures and trained a generation of officers who would train the next generation after them. She died at the age of 97, surrounded by family and friends, at peace with what she had accomplished. Her last words were a question, asked to no one in particular. Did I do enough? No one knew how to answer, but history would eventually provide one. 500 years after Sarah's death, the collective faced another crisis, not the darkness this time, but something different. A species from a distant galaxy, aggressive and territorial, who saw the collective as invaders in their space. War seemed inevitable. The collective's military responded exactly as Sarah had designed. The defense fleets mobilized within hours. The monitoring systems tracked every enemy movement. The officers, trained in human tactics, developed a strategy to end the conflict quickly and decisively. But before the fighting could begin, something remarkable happened. The enemy sent ambassadors. They had heard stories, they said. Stories about a civilization that had survived the darkness not once, but twice. Stories about ships that refused to die, crews that refused to surrender, a military tradition built on the simple principle of endurance. They had come to fight, but now they wanted to talk. The negotiations lasted months. They were difficult, complicated, full of misunderstandings and near disasters. But in the end, a peace was reached. The new species joined the collective, bringing their own strengths and perspectives to the galactic community. When asked why they had chosen peace instead of war, their ambassador gave an answer that would be remembered for centuries. We studied your history. We learned about the humans, about the darkness, about everything you survived. We realized that you would never stop fighting. You would take any hit we could give and keep coming. We could destroy your fleets, burn your worlds, kill billions of your people, and you would still find a way to fight back. That's not an enemy we wanted. That's an ally we needed. The collective continued to grow. More species joined, drawn by the promise of protection and prosperity. The galaxy became more connected, more unified, more peaceful than it had ever been. But they never forgot the lessons of the past. Every child learned the story of the darkness and the heroes who had defeated it. Every soldier trained in the tactics that had proven their worth over centuries. Every ship was built to survive. Human influence had spread so far that it was impossible to separate from the collective's identity. The old boundaries between species had almost disappeared. The descendants of the original humans were everywhere, their blood mixed with dozens of alien races, their philosophy woven into the fabric of galactic civilization. But the essential truth remained unchanged, the truth that James Morrison had demonstrated. at the Battle of Valar, the truth that Sarah Morrison had proven at the Second Corvan War, the truth that would guide the collective for as long as it existed. Weapons can hit hard, enemies can be overwhelming, the odds can seem impossible, but ships that survive can fight back, and ships that fight back can win. 1,000 years after the first contact between humans and the Kirath, a young pilot stood on the bridge of her first command. She was a mix of 6 different species, none of them fully human anymore, all of them carrying human blood somewhere in their veins. Her ship was called the Legacy, a small vessel assigned to patrol the quiet edges of collective space. She had been trained at the Morrison Academy on Vaughn Prime. She had studied the old battles, learned the old tactics, absorbed the old philosophy. She knew the history of her people, all of them, from the frightened refugees who had first stumbled into Kirath space to the confident civilization that now spanned 2 galaxies. Her first mission was routine, a survey of a distant system that sensors had flagged as potentially interesting. Nothing dangerous was expected. Nothing exciting was likely to happen. But as she guided her ship through the void, she felt a connection to everyone who had come before her, the commanders who had faced impossible odds, the crews who had refused to die, the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things because giving up was never an option. She understood finally what her teachers had been trying to tell her all those years. Being part of the collective wasn't about where you came from or what species you were. It was about what you were willing to do when everything was on the line. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders and dangers beyond imagining. Someday something might come out of the darkness that was bigger and stronger and more terrible than anything that had come before. When that day arrived, she would be ready, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she knew that fear was just the beginning of courage. Her communication officer reported that the survey was complete, nothing unusual. Time to head home. She took one last look at the stars spread out before her, the infinite possibilities waiting to be discovered. Then she smiled and gave the order. "All right, let's go." The Legacy turned and accelerated toward home, one small ship carrying one small crew through the endless night. Behind them, the universe continued its ancient dance of creation and destruction. Ahead of them, the future waited, unknown but not unready. Somewhere in the distance, the song was still being sung. The old song from Earth, the one that had spread across the galaxy and become the anthem of survival. It had changed over the centuries, translated into 1,000 languages, adapted to 1,000 cultures. But the message remained the same. We were hit hard. We survived. We hit back. And we will never stop. This was the legacy of humanity, not their ships or their weapons or their tactics, though all of these had changed the galaxy forever. It was their spirit, their absolute refusal to accept defeat, their stubborn, infuriating, magnificent determination to keep fighting no matter what. The collective had adopted this spirit. They had made it their own, and because of that, they would face whatever came next with the same courage that had carried them through the darkest times. The galaxy was safe, not because the threats had ended, but because the defenders would never stop rising to meet them. The story of humanity and the collective was far from over. New chapters were being written every day by every crew member on every ship, by every family on every world. The future stretched out like an endless ocean, full of storms and sunshine, challenges and triumphs. Whatever came next, they would be ready. They were survivors, and survivors always find a way.